I somehow feel like b5 is the natural follow-up, and b5 knight f3, I would even go rook e7. I somehow sense that Magnus's idea was with this knight e7 to g8 to somehow set up this strategical idea of eventually moving that knight from f6 to d7 and the knight from g8 jumping to f6, and he has done it instantly. He goes rook e7.
And knight c4, that is begging to be played. It hits the a5 pawn. Will Magnus initiate crazy tactics there with b5? Again, that's not really congruent with his style. Magnus trying to keep things relatively tactics-free in this endgame. Does that mean he is preparing to meet knight c4 with rook a8?
Probably, but it's extremely strange. There is this potential weakness on f7. Yes, the rook on e7 is protecting that pawn, but something tells me that this is very risky. I don't see yet the follow-up, but White's knight might be able to get to d6. Then, of course, Magnus will kick that knight away with rook d8. I'm a little bit puzzled by Magnus's choices.
It's not entirely unlikely that we get some sort of repetition of moves, right? Both players might end up being happy with a draw in this first game. From Pragg's perspective, he's already survived a scare at the start of this endgame. Magnus Carlsen's scare came earlier in the middle game. But will Pragg suddenly say, hey, your pieces are mighty passive all of a sudden. I'm up a minute on the clock. Let me try to press on the gas pedal. Big question whether Pragg will play knight c4. I think the answer is likely yes. But he could also make a slower improving move, like king h1 over to g1 or h3. So he's got quite a few of those improving moves in reserve that he can play if he wants to wait for Magnus to put his cards on the table. And he makes one of those moves. Bishop drops back to c2, overprotecting the e4 pawn.
That's a little bit of a surprise, because we kind of talked about the pressure on the f7 pawn. On the other hand, probably Pragg has sensed that Black has enough defenses. Knight d7 played. Exactly, Magnus is trying to reroute his knights. But is it not the right time to jump knight c4? Attacking that pawn, and knight's a different story, because after rook a8, we might be able to jump knight d6. Black isn't able to kick that knight immediately out of the game, and if you follow up with the natural knight c5, we might be able to start asking some question to that pawn on f7. Very interesting endgame on the board.
On the board, knight c4 and rook a8. Although even in that final position we were analyzing, Black's rook could go from a8 back to f8. I'm just not seeing, how Pragg can do more than ask questions. He can pose threats to the f7 pawn and to the b7 pawn, but it feels like Magnus has enough defensive firepower to keep everything at bay. I think the likeliest outcome here is a draw, but the situation getting more tense with every passing second. Both sides are now under 5 minutes. So this is, at this point, the equivalent of a blitz game.
Yes, and I also feel there is so much tension in the position, because yes, it does look like it's an endgame, things have stabilized. Long terms, Black can still be better if Black somehow gets knight gf6, knight c5 in, and White is unable to use the moment for active counterplay, then slowly Black will start to take over. It's a typical kind of peer defense. Yeah, it's long-term issues. Black has this lovely pawn structure. If he coordinates forces, then after all, let's not forget that White has 3 pawn islands and Black only has 2, and the knights will work beautifully together.
And Magnus has already converted a couple of slight advantages in the endgame in typical Magnus style. He did it on demand against Vincent Keimer to win the second match game and force a Raipa tiebreak. He did it in the second match game against Vasily Ivanchuk in a position that many thought would end surely in a draw that would have won in the match. But the fact remains, Carlsen has shown a lot of endgame prowess in this tournament. Pragg, he knows that he cannot relax. He cannot make a couple of lazy moves and give Carlsen's knights more activity. And g4, what a committal decision by Pragg. The engine doesn't like it. He's trying to drive the pawn up to g5 and restrict the knight on g8. But what if Carlsen drops into f6 and hits that pawn?
Yes, and provokes g5, then the knight jumps to h5. Suddenly, there will be a very lovely spot on f4. Clearly, Pragg relies on some knight takes e5 tactic that the knight on f4 will not be able to sit there forever, but then black might get the e5 square for the other knight. Strategically, this is a very committal decision.
And after knight gf6, the knight could actually drop back to h7 and then either backward to f8 or forward to g5 and eventually try to plant itself on f4. But Magnus, he plays pawn to f6 rather than knight f6. That is a huge surprise to me.
A very big surprise. Basically, I feel that it plays into White's hand. Clearly, Magnus is hoping to go knight h6 and knight f7.
g5.
Exactly, and Pragg jumps on the possibility. He instantly played the move rook g2, making sure that he will be able to meet knight h6 with g5.
And a very risky move, followed by an incredibly alert reaction by Pragg. Knight h6 is met with g5, and you need to play it now, because if the knight gets back to f7, then black institutes that clamp on the g5 square. And the worst case scenario for white is if you allow that knight to reach f4. That is the promised land. You have to open up the position in order to prevent that from happening. This position is going to keep sharpening up, especially if Pragg carries out the g5 pawn break, which seems very likely given what he's just played.
Exactly, I think this is what he had in his mind when he opted for g4. Can we talk about mutual hallucination or believing each other that the possibility of knight g8 to f6 was somehow missed by both players? Sometimes in the heat of the battle it can happen. And f6 rook g2 on the board. Now white has everything under control. One can forget about g4 being a question mark. g4 was a very good move if black had to play the move f6.
And Magnus can't stop the progress of the pawn by playing g5 himself, because the medicine is way worse than the disease. That would create a massive hole on f5. White could play knight d6 or knight e3, and knight d6 would carry a double attack on the b7 pawn and the f5 square. So Magnus will have to allow Pragg to open up the king side with g5. He's investing a lot of time here. He's down to 2.5 minutes, and he finally decides on knight h6. Pragg very likely to play g5 here and launch an all-out assault on that g6 pawn, which will be made a lot more vulnerable by the fact that the g-file will open up.
Yeah, however he's posing, he's not blitzing out. We assume that he will be very happy that he gets the chance of playing g5. And g5, f take g5, rook take g5, knight f7, that's the move that also gives black a lot of stability. The knight comes with a tempo, hits the rook on g5, and the rook falls back to g3. As you indicated, there will be a pressure on the g6 pawn. Also, this knight d6, knight f5 ideas are there, but things are heating up. g5 on the board.
Yep. And we have that position. Takes, and knight f7. As you were just showing, Peter, the or g5, and it drops back to g2. And I thought that rook g3 made a little bit more sense, but maybe Pragg trying to bring his rook all the way back away from the influence of black's knights.
Yeah, rook g3 looked a bit more natural, but okay, if you are in blitz mode, rook e6 played by Magnus as well, making sure that the d6 square is beautifully protected by the knight on f7, rook on e6. The rook also protects the pawn on g6, and eventually setting up this very nice little rook f6. We have already seen the move queen f6, which had such a big impact on the game. I do believe that rook f6, also combined with some knight f8 defending the g6 pawn, is a wonderful rerouting for black.
The initiative has changed hands several times in this endgame, but that doesn't mean it can't change hands again. Pragg now down to 2.5 minutes. And if black's knights get active, there is still that f4 square, there is still the d-file, and there is still the rook on a8, which has not made its presence felt just yet. But if Pragg takes his foot off the gas pedal and he lets black's knights get active, it's so hard to deal with a pair of active knights in time pressure. The move bishop b3 comes to mind, but case in point, you might be running into potentially knight d7 to c5. Although there are some tactics with rook takes f7 and knight takes e5. All of that has to be calculated carefully. And Pragg now under 2 minutes. You can sense the anxiety. Both players locked in concentration.
Yeah, very critical moment. It's if someone just looks at the evaluation bar and sees 0-0, he does not get the sense, the real feel for this position. This position has so much spice. There is so lot of finesses. Very crucial decisions for both sides in the next couple of moves.
Rook d2 hitting the knight directly. The knight can move, but Carlsen could also meet fire with fire. He could slide his rook to f6 nonetheless, and he does. And he offers an exchange of rooks that seems to be in black's favor.
Sensational play. Basically, rook e6 was connected with this rook f6. He had to force it at the rook move, rook d2, which hits the knight. Will be met by rook f6. Everything else would have run into some tactical issues. Amazing play by Magnus.
And Pragg now down to a minute on the clock. He's suddenly down 2 minutes, which could become really important as this endgame continues to sharpen up. White has several ways to keep the rooks on the board. He can double on the d file. He can play rook f to d1, but then you have to reckon with the black knight getting super active on c5, and white's king is not entirely safe. The rook from a8 could later on, it could slide to the h file and start exerting pressure on h2. 40 seconds for Praggnanandhaa as he exchanges rooks, tries to simplify the position, and I like that decision.
I think it was the correct call. It's not about fighting for initiative. You just have to make sure that in time trouble with 40 seconds on the clock, you have things under control. Maybe even go b4. Yes, b4
Excellent
on the board.
Move. He is trying to simplify things by force. Exchange pawns, make this position easier to play, easier to handle with less than a minute on the clock. And Peter, he's built up 20 very important seconds with his last two moves.
Yeah, creates counterplay, also signals Magnus that, you still have that b7 pawn, and if I gonna get the pawn to a5, if I ever take that pawn on b7, then the a pawn will be way too powerful. This puts Magnus also on alert. I don't think that he can afford to play for the initiative. It might be that it's a dynamic balance.
And if he plays the move b5 himself, he runs into knight to b6, followed by a5. So it's entirely possible for black to lose control of this game. And I love Pragg's last move, b2, b4, remaining on top and creating practical pressure on black's queen side as Carlsen reroutes his king toward the center.
Yeah, he's probably setting up ideas like king e7, rook d8, trying to trade rooks. Is that a possibility? Or is he thinking that if I have the king on e7, making sure that the anti-squares d7, d6 are well covered, then maybe I will be able to activate my rook on the h file? Is he hoping for some counterplay?
And Pragg
Very
doing
tense.
the same. He brings his own king up toward the center and maybe trying to overprotect the e4 pawn with king f3. First, he plays a5, fixing the queenside pawns, fixing the pawn on b7 for a rainy day. And Carlsen, we mentioned this move earlier. He brings his rook to the other side of the board, and he's starting to exert pressure on Pragg's king side. That rook can dive into h4 and hit e4, and black's knights are rearing to get even more active. This could get out of control for Pragg, who's down to 20 seconds now on the clock.
Yeah,
He's
under
hesitating.
some pressure. Yeah, it's never easy to start defending something with little time
10
on the
seconds.
clock.
He's got to move, and he does get 10 seconds added to his clock per move, but the situation starting to deteriorate just a little bit. Knight h5. Uh-oh, and the knight getting to f4. This is getting scary for Pragg.
The king g2 move was very unfortunate. Now he has to sidestep from the fork. King g1 played.
Knight f4, Magnus sensing the moment, and the other knight can jump into g5, creating fork threats, maybe even some mate threats in some situations. Uh-oh.
Just in a couple of... And Pragg down to 8 seconds.
And look at the speed with which Carlsen is moving. Every piece becoming more and more active. The rook coming into h3. It can drive into c3. And suddenly there are all these forks that Pragg has to keep in mind. He's got 6 seconds. And a6, a very panicky reaction as he gives up a pawn.
Yeah, it is a panicky reaction because knight a5 can be met by rook c3. Also, bishop a4 can be met by rook c6, knight g5. All this combination of forces seem too much to handle.
knight g5 might be crushing, because if white takes on e5, black's king just moves up to e6, forces the knight out of e5, and then knight f3 will fork the rook and the king. And Magnus doesn't see it. He plays rook c3, but knight g5 now is even stronger. And he plays it. And this is almost over.
This is over, yes, because knight takes c6 can be met by rook takes c6, bishop c6, knight f3 fork. Pragg in a lot of trouble.
Knight f3, the knights are running amok. White's counterplay on the queen side has not amounted to anything. And Carlsen has left himself with 3 whole minutes on the clock to figure out the last couple of touches here. Black is completely winning here, but Pragg will continue to fight until the last drop of blood. He tries to get the rooks off the board, but Carlsen can play rook a3, and there's got to be some sort of a checkmating mechanism here. Knight h3 and rook a3 wins the game. It wins a piece.
Exactly. And Magnus pauses because he knows exactly that, yes, this is it. Let me just be precise. And yes, on the board, knight g5 to h3 check. No matter where white is going, king f1 or king h1 will have the same problem that rook a3 will follow with a double attack on the bishop and rook a1 checkmate. The knights, just monster knights.
And it took Carlsen so much time and so much finesse to get those knights to where they are. It took a lot of turnarounds and the initiative changed hands. But Carlsen laughs last, and he will laugh longest in this first game. He will just move his king to f6, getting away from the checks. And the threat of rook a1 checkmate and rook takes a4 forces Praggnanandhaa to resign the first game. And you can see there a dejected Pragg will not have a lot of time to marinate on this game, because he has a task in front of him, and that is to win the next game with the black pieces, Peter.
Yeah, it's a mammoth task. We have to give credit for Magnus sensationally sensing the moment, and that king march with king f8, king e7 prepared his activation of his rook, and once the rook activated itself, then the knights were jumping. What a big victory for Magnus Carlsen.